way to get to essential services. And for low and middle income workers that have to commute long distances because of high housing costs near job centers. We are nearing the point where the legislature must take action to address these funding needs. As we do so, we must ensure our transportation funding system mitigates current and future distributional challenges while addressing funding for our critical programs. As you think about a future funding source for transportation, I would suggest you discuss ways to address distributional challenges faced by rural and working class commuters today and how to mitigate these through future funding strategies. I would also suggest making use of existing efforts, such as California Integrated Transportation Project's plans to expedite income verification and its upcoming pilot program to help working class commuters pay for transportation, as well as the work of the California Air Resources Board to provide a just transition to working class commuters into cleaner vehicles. I mention these efforts because addressing distributional challenges and a funding mechanism may require wraparound support programs to ensure that rural and working class commuters are truly supported. I look forward to today's panel and encourage all of you to take part in these discussions with your legislators and other policymakers to help craft a solution that supports all of our communities. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Grisby. We appreciate those comments and appreciate the fact that you're going to stick around and listen, even if you have to jump on the phone instead of through Zoom directly. And look at that, a thumbs up from Commissioner Eager. I do want to acknowledge that we have also the California Transportation Commission's Vice Chair, Clarissa Falcone, is joined us, as well as Chair Emeritus Leanne Eager. So thank you for joining us. I'm glad you continue to take road user charge issues and the declining gas tax and diesel tax revenue seriously. And I think I just got a note from our development director, Nicole, that we are maxed out, but people are being directed to the live stream on YouTube so that they can watch it. In terms of, I guess, we didn't upgrade our Zoom service as much as we should have for this. I also want to acknowledge that Michelle Warren from Resources Legacy Fund, who's been key to making sure that the funding exists for Coalition for Clean Air and Transform to do this work, has joined us. So thank you, Michelle. Everyone give Michelle a thanks for that. We're going to move on now to Zach, who's going to talk about the background issues on transportation pricing. So Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. And thank you everyone for joining here, either on the Zoom or on YouTube. My name is Zach Deitch-Gross. I'm the Policy Director at Transform. We work to reshape housing and transportation decisions in a way that centers community needs and combats the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with just an overview of the gas tax and then go into how a road charge might replace it. So state transportation revenues primarily come from fuel taxes and vehicle fees. Taxes on gas and diesel alone generate about $10 billion for the state. And this revenue goes largely to maintaining and expanding the state highway system and local roads, with a small portion of it also going to transit and active transportation. And while this is a vital source of funds, it's also unaffordable and inequitable. And so there's a real need and opportunity for change. Californians face the second highest transportation costs in the country and some of the highest fuel costs. According to Caltrans, Californians pay over $280 a year in state gas taxes charged at the pump, and over $800 more annually in vehicle repair costs due to poorly maintained roads. So not only is the gas tax expensive, but it disproportionately impacts those who cannot afford more fuel-efficient vehicles or cannot afford to live near jobs, schools, and other amenities. And you heard Chair Grisby mention this in talking about making sure the proportionate benefits and costs, particularly for folks like rural drivers. But as you can see from the graph on the right, go back one slide, please. Thank you. our lowest income families are paying significantly more than those with the highest incomes. Our lowest income families spend on average 30% of their incomes on transportation. And that's just the average. Drilling down using the US DOT Consumer Expenditure Survey data, low income families that rely on a car, their expenditures jump to 38% of their household incomes, while it's just 5% of their incomes for families that do not own a car. And what this points to is that owning a car is very expensive. And if we're talking about increasing affordability for all Californians, we need to think not only about maintaining our existing roadway system, but also investing in transit, walking, and biking and affordable housing near transit that reduce costs and the cost of driving for all Californians. Next slide, please. So if the status quo is unaffordable and equitable, we also have a significant urgency to make change because the gas tax, as Chair Grisby mentioned, is in decline. Again, the Legislative Analyst's Office projects that revenues from the gas tax will decline as much as $2 billion by 2030 and significantly more in future years. And thank you. This is due to fuel efficiency and electric vehicle adoption. And if California is serious about meeting its climate goals laid out in California Air Resources Board's 2022 scoping plan, their revenue will actually decline at a faster rate. So the better we do, the more urgency we have to replace the gas tax. And again, with a funding source that supports our transportation future. And next slide, please. We believe a statewide road user charge could really fill that gap. A road user charge, for those who are not familiar, charges drivers based on how many miles they drive rather than how many gallons of gas they use. So under a flat per mile fee, that means a sports car and a minivan would both pay the same rate. But we could also structure that fee to make sure electric vehicles pay less, that heavier vehicles that create more wear and tear on the road pay more, or that the per mile fee could vary by income to address affordability and equity concerns. And our vision is one where we not only fill the revenue lost by the gas tax, but advance climate equity and affordability based on how the state road user charge is structured and how that revenue is spent. And before I toss it on to Sophia to talk a little bit about what those principles entail, I just want to mention that we have been studying a road user charge for a long time. It was in 2014 that the California legislature created the Road User Charge Technical Advisory Committee to start piloting and assessing a mileage-based fee to replace the gas tax. To date, 2 pilots have been conducted in 2017 and 2024. Well, the state has also analyzed the impacts on supercommuters, on rural communities, and tribal communities to make sure those constituencies are front and center when it comes to a road user charge. And while we definitely need to do additional areas of study, like an income-based variable rate, given the past 10 years of study and the anticipated gas tax declines, now is the time to really focus on the implementation of a road charge. The good news is that many states have already moved forward with this. Oregon, Utah, and Virginia already have voluntary road charges, while another 13 states are currently piloting it. And Hawaii is leading the way and has moved towards a mandatory road charge starting this year. So those are the basics of the gas tax and the road charge. I'm sure we could get more into the weeds, and maybe we will during the panel. But for now, I want to pass it over to Sophia to talk specifically about how a road charge could advance climate equity and affordability for all Californians. Take it away, Sophia.
Thank you, Zach. Yeah, so my name is Sophia Avrakova. I'm a policy advocate with the Coalition for Clean Air. Next slide, please. So the Coalition for Clean Air, Transform, Climate Plan, and 20 other additional environmental groups, next slide, please, have developed a list of principles of how we would like to see a road charge program structured in a way that promotes equity and sustainability. Next slide, please. And we wanted to share today our 3 principles of what that would look like. Next slide. So first of all, as my colleague Zach mentioned, the current system is regressive. Everyone pays the same amount for gas despite different income levels, meaning that low-income folks are paying more proportionally to their wage. And we know that the gas tax is set to expire as people transition to using zero-emission vehicles. Therefore, the state will need to look at funding alternatives to ensure it can keep adequately funding transportation infrastructure and maintenance. And this is our opportunity to make sure that this alternative is more equitable than the current option. And the current discussions surrounding the road charge have mostly focused on developing a flat fee revenue neutral system. This means that everyone will be charged the same amount per mile to drive, and the rate of that would be adjusted to ensure that the transportation funding levels remain the same as they currently are. However, we suggest that the state should instead look at implementing an income-based rate structure. This would ensure that Californians pay proportionate to their income, which would reduce the economic burden placed on low-income households. And studies show that if we implement a flat rate road charge, it would increase costs for the poorest urban households at about less than $1 a week or $27 annually. While that difference is small, it still poses a burden on low-income households and benefits high-income earners who have the means to pay more. And our state is actually already looking at developing an income verification and rate adjustment program through the California Integrated Travel Project, known as CALITP, to incentivize transit ridership. And we believe that a similar system can be adopted for a potential road charge program. Next slide, please. Additionally, as currently proposed, a flat fee would also increase costs for those driving fuel-efficient vehicles and decrease costs for those driving less fuel-efficient vehicles. And this is because it would just average out the amount people paying for gas, with fuel-efficient vehicle drivers suddenly being forced to pay more to account for those with poor fuel efficiency. And this is very counterintuitive to California's goals of sustainability and addressing climate change, as it would encourage the use of inefficient vehicles. And it is estimated that a flat road charge fee would result in the usage of 5 billion additional gallons of petroleum per year, resulting in 45 million tons of GHG emissions. And so therefore, we propose that California also take fuel efficiency in account when designing a road charge by incorporating fuel economy and vehicle weight into the fee structure. And in particular, when it comes to vehicle weight, heavy vehicles are not only less fuel efficient, but it also cause more damage to roads, meaning that they could be used to pay for road maintenance. There's already a road charge pilot program under SB 339 that is currently looking at testing different mileage rate options and their impacts on California's ability to meet its climate and air quality goals, with the results of that study being released in 2026. And then finally, we would like to see the road charge program continue to incentivize the transition to zero emission vehicles. And this can be done by ensuring that the amount that electric or hydrogen vehicle owners pay under a road charge is lower than the amount that gas cars pay for fuel. And additionally, the road charge should consider removing the electrical vehicle registration fee so that EV owners only have to pay per mile. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. And finally, we want to see a change in not only how we collect the revenue, but also how this revenue is spent. And as it's currently being discussed, the revenue collected from road charge would be spent on programs focusing on maintaining and building new roads. But at the same time, our state is continuing to struggle to meet its climate and air quality goals. And studies show that unless California triples its rate of reducing greenhouse gases in the next 5 years, we'll be unable to meet our law-mandated climate targets set by SB 32. And the transportation sector in particular contributes to almost half of these GHG emissions and is also a large source of air pollution. And CalSTA has been developing strategies to better align our transportation investments with climate action through the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, known as CAPTI. However, according to its own analysis, even after those strategies have been implemented, transportation funding programs are continuing to pollute and increase vehicle miles traveled. And if we ensure that the collected revenue is aligned with CAPTI principles, we can prioritize the goals of reducing climate emissions and air pollution within our transportation spending. This would mean more funding for transit projects, walking and biking infrastructure, and clean vehicles. And these types of projects would then help improve multimodal accessibility by allowing people who can't drive to get to their destination, would reduce transportation costs for families by providing more affordable alternatives to driving, would reduce traffic by reducing the number of cars on the road, and would create a cleaner and healthy environment. Thank you. I'll pass it to Dr. Agarwal.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to share today. I'm going to be presenting the results of some research done by the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State. Next slide. And we done an annual national survey of adults for 16 years now. asking people their views on whether they think it would be reasonable to raise more federal revenue. We are talking in here in a federal context, and that includes asking about mileage fees. So next slide. Oh, I should acknowledge also my co-author, Hillary Nixon. Next slide. So we started this survey project in 2010. They were initially phone surveys, but that just got prohibitively expensive. So in 2019, we switched over to online surveys. And for every year, we've had at least 1,200 respondents, and in recent years, 2,500, because online surveys make it a lot cheaper to get your results. So as I mentioned, we have asked people their thoughts on raising the federal gas tax rate, but also some questions related to mileage fees. And those are what I'm going to be talking about today. As a side note, if anyone wants to learn more, we also ask a lot of questions about people's sociodemographics, their travel behavior, whether they live in an urban or rural area, and also what kind of priorities they have for how their transportation revenues get spent. Next slide. So the data from this year was collected in February. We do these every spring. Next slide. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is share with you what happens when we ask people, would you support a mileage fee that is applied for all the miles you drive? And for the first, 10 years or so, we told people it would be a penny a mile. And we just picked that because it was a nice round number and easy for people to understand. In 2021, we did change it to say 3 pennies per mile. So this is showing you over time what we have seen in terms of the percent of respondents who would somewhat or strongly support that. Started out very low in the 20s, but then starting around 2019, it's pretty reliably bounced between, around 40%, give or take a little bit. So there has been an increase in support, but still it's clearly not an overwhelmingly popular idea. Next slide. So now what I want to do is show you a variety of data points from our findings that help us understand how people, how their support might relate to different ways we structure the rate for a mileage fee, which our previous speakers have emphasized could be a very valuable component of any program design. So what you're seeing here, it's the same slide you saw a moment ago, but I've added a green line on top. And this is the support when we told people, well, what if we charged that same mileage fee of a penny, or recently it was 3 pennies per mile, but we varied the rate so that, and we use the term more polluting. So more polluting vehicles paid more and less polluting vehicles paid less. So the first and most important thing I would say is to notice that the green line, so that's what I'll call the green rate, is always above the yellow line. Year after year, more Americans said they would support a mileage fee if you had that variable rate. And I think that that is a critically important finding to take away, because I hear in a lot of discussions concerns that, well, anything other than a flat rate is just too confusing and people won't like it. And so if you take nothing away from today, from what I have to say here, please remember green line always on top of yellow line. That difference has shrunk in recent years, so we should also acknowledge. Next slide. Sort of similarly, we had a separate question where we asked people what rate they think electric vehicles should pay. And we gave them 3 options, same as ICE vehicles, half the rate or nothing. And it's pretty much split half-half between people who think, hey, EVs should just pay what everybody else does, or they should pay something less. Very few people say nothing. More common to people to select half the rate. Next slide. We also, very critical to today's discussion, asked people, if Congress adopts a mileage fee, would you support or oppose charging a lower rate to low-income drivers? And on this recent year, we found 63% of respondents supported a lower rate for low-income drivers. We've asked this question for something like 4 years now, and it's always been very simple response. So clearly a strong majority of Americans do support this idea. Next slide. Now, I'd like to introduce another rate structure, which has not been commonly discussed. I'm guessing for at least a number of you, this might be the first time you've thought about this possibility. But some colleagues and I, when we were thinking about rates, turned to what can we learn from the utility industry? How do we charge for power and water, for example? And there are cases where utilities use what is called a block rate structure. And the idea here is that, for some, as we put it into our survey, which of the following mileage fee rate structures do you think would be fair? So the first option is the fee is the same for every mile the vehicle drives all year. And then the second option is the fee is lower for the first 5,000 miles driven in the year and then higher for additional miles. And so here we got a 50-50 split. Now, what I want to draw your attention to with the idea of the block rate is that on average, low-income households drive far fewer miles per year, even in rural areas, than high-income households. And that's just because it's really expensive to drive. This is not a huge surprise. So if we used a block rate like this, by definition, for the average, at least low-income household, most of the miles, or at least a large fraction of the miles they're driving, would be at this lower rate. High income drivers, both urban and rural, drive a whole lot more. They would be paying the higher rate for more of their miles. And what I think is really nice about this block rate structure is it enormously simplifies the administration, because we no longer need to ask people or document what their income is. Also, I think potentially it could help with the optics, because obviously there is a percentage of our population that doesn't believe in a lower rate for low-income drivers. And here they're not sort of explicitly getting any kind of special reduction. Everybody gets the same. So next slide. I'll just a couple more points to wrap up. So next slide. We also asked people how often they would want to pay if there were a federal mileage rate. And the majority of people, about 3/4, want to pay somewhat less often than once a year. And this is important because I think there has been in other states that have looked at this often an assumption that maybe you'd pay an annual bill. But clearly that is not what the majority of Americans prefer. And also thinking about both climate and equity, it is much harder for a low-income household to pay a few $100s a year in one lump than it is to pay $3 here, $4 here. So from an equity perspective, I think it's important that we not have a system where you have to pay once a year. From a climate perspective, to the extent that we want to encourage people to drive a bit fewer miles per year, if you pay once a year, you don't really connect that to your miles. Whereas if you have more frequent payments, it sends you repeatedly that it's tiny, but that small kind of reminder that, hey, maybe I should cut my costs by driving a little bit less. Next slide. So this is going to be the last piece of data from our survey I show you. And next slide. And here I want to introduce some gas tax questions we asked, but it does relate to the arguments I'm making. So we asked people if they would support raising the federal gas tax rate by 10 cents per gallon. And the first time we asked that, we just said that the revenue would be used for transportation, and we didn't give any more detail. So that's at the bottom of this list here. It says base case for transportation. This year, 38% of people supported it, so very low. But then we asked a series of questions where we said, well, what if the money were dedicated to, and we asked different purposes. So what if it was dedicated to maintaining streets, roads, and highways? And what if it was dedicated to reducing accidents and improving safety? Support skyrockets. when we ask about maintenance, we have 75% of people who said they would somewhat or strongly support that. It's very, very unusual to hear any kind of tax or fee get 75% of support. And it was almost as strong for reducing accidents and improving safety. So what I draw away here is I think that regardless of whether people are thinking about a gas tax or a mileage fee, we can increase their acceptance or even outright support by making sure that we spend the money on things they value. So let's wrap up now. Next slide. Next slide. Just a quick few sort of to extract key takeaways, thinking about both public support, but also equity. And I should have added climate to my heading here. Think beyond the flat rate. I think a flat rate mileage fee is the worst possible option in most by most criteria that we care about. Secondly, this is both for equity and climate. Don't just have people pay once a year because it's much harder for low income families, and it sends less of a price signal to potentially influence behavior. And then finally, if we do want to gain public acceptance, we have to tell people how the money is going to spend. It can't be just a sort of black box transportation. And hopefully, the options that the greatest number of people seem to support are maintenance and safety, which are things that benefit everybody regardless of income. And I think most transportation professionals would agree are critically important to focus on. So next slide. I'm assuming the slides will be available later. So I've just put out some links here to different reports that might be of interest to some of you. And with that, I will wrap up.
Thank you, Dr. Agrawal. Appreciate that. We're going to shift to our panel now, and as we do that, we're going to bring Hannah Krieger into the panel for the conversation. So, Hannah, I'm just going to ask you if you have any comments on what you heard so far before we go to the panel discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to be here with you all. I was reflecting a bit and I was thinking like, yeah, I'm sure a lot of folks who came to join this webinar were motivated by the anxiety around our declining transportation revenue. And that's a very real problem. And this might be a bit of a wild thing to say in the context of this webinar topic, but more money doesn't solve everything. And in my opinion, California's transportation system is so fundamentally broken that simply replacing the gas tax with road charge and continuing to spend the revenue in the way that we've always done, it will not deliver better outcomes. California has the largest transportation budget of any US state. Yet the quality of our roads and our highways are shockingly bad, like embarrassingly bad. We rank 47th in the country. How is that possible? And it's because we continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on expanding highways. These highway projects are extremely costly, growing at a rate of 24% a year. They require continued maintenance that the Legislative Analyst's Office found that the state cannot afford. Meanwhile, study after study proves that expanding highways doesn't reduce traffic. It actually encourages more people to drive and therefore makes traffic worse. So now if you see the whole situation, Californians are spending more on their transportation costs than any other people in states. Yet as a result of how our state spends our revenue, California is rated worst traffic in the country. We rank 8th highest pedestrian fatalities in the nation. We have some of the most polluted air in the country. And so I'm not trying to be like a negative Nancy here, but any sensible person would conclude, why isn't our massive transportation budget helping to solve any of our most pressing transportation problems? And it's because the way we spend our dollars is not effective. We've spent decades prioritizing building out roads and highways, trapping people into car dependency, but it's only made all of our quality of life worse. And it's not looking good for our financials either. Like any financial advisor would look at our accounts, be like, the math's not mathin', right? And so if we want to see different outcomes, we have to spend our funds differently. And I do believe road user charge has the potential to change our relationship with cars and highways, to spend more on walking, biking, transit, and electrification projects that give people more options to get out of their vehicles. But that requires us to do road charge right, in alignment with what other folks have presented 100%. And so I think this is our opportunity to actually help fix California's transportation system, but that requires us to be bold and spend our dollars differently.
I think we're going to just take that clip of what you said, Hannah, and use it on social media to convince people to do the right thing. Thank you for that. The other panelists are with us now too, Zach and Asha and Sophia. And I guess I have to admit something. I think I underestimated the sophistication and the intelligence and the insights of our participants, because the questions that we're getting, I think, are probably better than the ones that I made up for our panel. So let's get through the panel conversation as quickly as we can and get to the questions that the participants have been asking, because there's a lot of really good ones that I've seen so far. Let's see. Let's start off. And remember, if you see questions that you like, please promote them, and so that we can get some to rise to the top. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of really good ones. But can someone just explain the difference between a mileage-based road user charge and this issue of congestion pricing? Don't make me answer it. Someone jump in.
I'll just be very quick. They are completely different, although they could be used simultaneously. So congestion pricing is just the idea that if we're charging for use of road space or anything else, when it's really busy and crowded, we charge a little bit more. And when there are not many people around, we charge less. And the goal of this is not just to sort of gouge people and, like make them all suffer because they all have to drive during commutes. The idea is that as we charge money, a few people start to decide, "Oh, maybe I won't drive, maybe I'll drive later, or I'll carpool." And so this price actually can be used as a tool to reduce congestion. And it's honestly about the only way, short of just banning cars, that we can actually guarantee no congestion if we apply the principle correctly. And that's used in London and Singapore and a few other places, and on our hot lanes.
And recently in New York, which gave us a lot of really good data.
Thank you. Really exciting example.
Can't forget
A
that.
mileage fee is totally different. It could have a congestion component to the rate, like you could charge more per mile if people were driving at rush hour on freeways, but it is just an entirely separate thing.
Okay, great. Thank you for the answer, Asha. What we're hearing nearly every politician in California talk about now is affordability. It seems like it's every other word out of their mouths, and it's being interpreted in different ways, and sometimes it's being looked at very simplistically, and I don't hear a lot of people talking about it in more complicated ways. But I do think that when it comes to road user charge, there are affordability arguments in favor of a road user charge. And I was wondering if you have any opinions on what those might be.
I can kick us off here, Joe. As I mentioned in my slides, and as many people know from personal experience, owning and driving a car is incredibly expensive. And so we have to start with the assumption that we need to reduce the cost of transportation for everyone. And that doubling down on car-based infrastructure, as Hannah mentioned, is not going to get us there. So a road charge allows us to move beyond the status quo that's just not working for folks. That's not working for whether it's rural or urban folks. Whether it's folks sitting in congestion or have to drive many hours to work and back, we need to redistribute how we're spending the money and how people are charged. And so I think just starting out understanding that the road charge is a way to meet Californians' need to address these issues and concerns around equity and affordability and climate. And we have to get it right. We have to structure the charge and the investments in a way that meets people where they're at and supports active and public transportation as well as road maintenance. But there's a real urgency to act. And if we're serious about affordability, that action starts with replacing the gas tax with something better.
And I mean, even more fundamentally, because none of the panelists today are arguing against using gas tax revenue or road user charge revenue, are against using it for safety projects and for road maintenance projects, because we need to maintain the roads we have, obviously. And I think, aren't there also a lot of costs associated with crashes and a lot of costs associated with vehicle maintenance because of roads that are in poor condition?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another way to think about, costs and affordability is like the the economic losses of being stuck in traffic. Like anyone who lives in California knows that like you can't go anywhere without being stuck in traffic. And there was some data recently that came out of this network called the Clean Rides Network, which a lot of our groups are a part of. And we did some polling across 7 states, wanting to understand like what are people's like motivations and messaging that resonates around why we should build a sustainable transportation system. And I was actually surprised by the results. It wasn't climate, it wasn't health, those were like the lowest ranking. The top messages were reducing transportation costs and reducing traffic. And I think this lends itself to the conversation on road user charge. And we absolutely need to be leading with an affordability message, but also leading with a message around, how is this going to reduce your time stuck in traffic? How is this going to help you get home to your families quicker? Now, to be real, like no one wants to be told that like they are the ones that have to get out of their own car, right? We have to frame it as like, let's give people options to, alternative transportation options that will get other people out of their cars. That means you won't be stuck behind as much traffic. So I think it's really delicate messaging, but truly playing up to people's motivations, which are affordability and reducing time in traffic.
So on the affordability issue, Asha, I know you did work on the question of whether a road user charge would adversely um, impact what people who drive a lot, people who drive for a living, or people who live in rural areas. And you had somewhat of a counterintuitive finding, right?
Yes, actually, I've just requested sharing powers. So I want to share a couple of things. So we did, some colleagues and I, a study. Now we are using 2017 data because that is the most recent data that is available with details on how households in California drive. So my guess is things have changed somewhat since then, 8 years, but not enormously. And we looked at urban versus rural households, and we looked at households in different income brackets. And we looked at 4 things. How efficient are their vehicles by household? How many miles do they drive? How much fuel tax are they currently paying? And then if they transferred to a flat rate road user charge, what would this do to their costs? And so I want to highlight a couple of things, and I'll put a link to this. Or actually, I think I already did put a link to this into the chat earlier. But first of all, there's a lot of people who very appropriately say, well, what about fuel efficiency? Don't, urban or well-income households have much, much more fuel efficient vehicles? Interestingly, we found that it was but if you compare the highest income households and the lowest income households, yes, the higher income households have more fuel efficient vehicles, but 8% more efficient. So it's there, but it's not maybe quite as much of a difference as people think. However, and if we compare urban and rural households, again, I think there's an assumption that it's just this huge difference. Well, it's 12%. The urban households on average are driving 12% more efficient vehicles. Now, where we start to see much bigger changes is in mileage. But again, I think there's an assumption that this, I think, is one of the single most important maybe things to take away from here. Rural households, everybody says, oh my gosh, they have to drive so much farther than urban households. We found, and this is again on average, individual cases will be different, that yes, the rural households are driving more, but 18% more. So it's not like they're driving 3 times as much. However, when we look at how much you drive by income, The high income households are driving 61% more miles per week than the lowest income households. And so this gets back to if we think about, well, yeah, let me just sort of pause here. And then there was one other thing. Let me figure out. I had a bunch of screens open. This is where we look at weekly household vehicle miles by annual household group. So we're kind of breaking all that down, and we have rural is the yellow bars and blue is the urban people, and then we have these different income brackets. So again, at the lowest income, there's not a huge difference between the mileage rural and urban drivers are traveling. And I think that just comes back to people can't afford it. The fuel tax is the least of their problems. It's, fuel at all, insurance, maintenance, all those other things. And then as people get higher income, we do start to see more of a difference with the rural drivers are driving more miles per week. And that difference increases the richer you get. So let me pause. I know I've thrown out a lot of details. I'll stop
That's
there.
a lot for people to digest. And fortunately, we're not going to solve it all this morning. We have we have some time. We certainly have time to get this idea to start bubbling around in people's brains and getting it through the process. Anyone have any thoughts on what people most misunderstand about a road user charge?
I mean, I can jump in and I'll go back. I think it just again comes back to affordability. Like people see this program and they think, oh, I'm barely affording anything right now, and the government wants to, tax me even more. But I think there is an opportunity to use the road user charge and provide actually some relief, especially for lower income Californians, by changing the way we structure the rate of the road user charge so that it benefits low income Californians the most. They can see reductions there, and also, changing the way we're investing those dollars instead of going into highway projects, investing more in transit, walkability, bikeability projects so that low-income Californians can again choose not to drive and spend a lot on gas and instead take the more affordable option. So I think there's definitely an opportunity here to improve affordability.
Yeah, there are some people who argue what we should just do is keep it as simple as possible. And I mean, I spent many years as a chair of the CTC Road User Charge Technical Advisory Committee, and there were a group of people who said, just keep it simple, just replace the gas tax and spend it on the same things. Don't make it complicated, or else it'll never happen. Others, and I think most of these panelists, if not all our panelists today, I've been advocating to use this opportunity to create a less regressive and more equitable system, and then to also use the new sources of funding transportation for other priorities. Would you only argue one side of that, or are there people who are thinking that the only way we get this through is to keep it simple?
I think you're spot on. The only way we get this through is if we ensure that equity is built into the fundamental structure. I mean, simplicity sounds great from like an administrative perspective, but like that's not going to win probably one of the biggest political battles of the upcoming decade. Like that's not going to win hearts and minds. And there are going to be some trust issues of the public around like why should we be giving you more of our money when it's not delivering on basic outcomes? And I think that's where we need to be intentional about like selling the vision of like what this investment could be and how it would fundamentally change people's lives for the better.
Yeah, I keep telling people, I work on two of the three main problems in California: air pollution, congestion. The one I don't cover is out of control celebrities. But Hannah, if we can figure out a way to get out of control celebrities under control with this process, then maybe we could hit it out of the park. I want to get to the questions that people have been submitting. But there is one question I want to ask the panel. we have to acknowledge that there are political headwinds. Like you said, Hannah, it's going to be the biggest battle of the next 10 years, probably, to get this through. And how are we going to convince the public and policymakers that we need to move forward with some sort of a alternative to gas and diesel taxes? How do we actually overcome those political headwinds?
I can kick us off, Joe. And I think this goes back to also what people most misunderstand about the issue is it goes back to the title of our webinar. It's replacing the gas tax. I think the completely natural reaction is, oh, this is another tax and California is already unaffordable. I think we need to reframe that. And every time we're talking about this is the gas tax is not working. It's not working to maintain our crumbling infrastructure. It's not working to lower transportation costs for Californians, and it's in decline. So we are replacing a bad tax that is inequitable and makes transportation unaffordable with a better source of funding transportation. And I think really framing that around this is not an additional burden. This is an opportunity we see to improve transportation outcomes. I also want to call out one thing that, New York just did in their pricing program, which they had a lockbox, where they made sure that the revenue from congestion pricing went to the priorities they were promising the folks who are getting charged. And I think that's another piece we really need to make sure we get right, to combat these political headwinds and secure the trust of voters. And that's making sure that we're investing the revenue we generate from this better tax source into the things that will make transportation more affordable and more accessible and allow everyone in California to thrive. And if we can get those things right, and if we can make sure we hit those messages, those headwinds start pushing for us instead of against us.
And if I can also jump in, I honestly think that the public is already convinced. As we saw in Dr. Agarwal's presentation, there is a strong support for developing a good and thoughtful road user charge program. I do think the challenge lies is then convincing the decision makers to take the next step. And as Zach mentioned in his presentation, California has been researching the road user charge for a long, long time, I think since 2014 at least. But there's been hesitation to take the next step in implementing it. And I think, it will become easier as our revenues decline further and we get to the point where unless we do something, we have no money left for road maintenance. But I think, having these types of conversations, educating legislators on this, again, showing public support through polling, I think can all create an environment where decision makers feel comfortable taking the next step.
I'll add just a couple of quick things to all what my colleagues have said here. One is, I think if we could get all of our elected officials to participate in a pilot, it would help. Obviously they need to also be convinced that this is good policy, that the public is supportive, but we have seen for a couple of decades that with road pricing, people are very opposed. And then if you stick them in a pilot and you survey them at the beginning of the pilot and at the end, they are more supportive at the end. And we've seen that with congestion pricing, and we've seen it in California's own road user charge pilots and across the state. So that's one, at least my pipe dreams, is that we could help our legislators just experience it themselves. Secondly, California is obviously very different from Oklahoma, but a lot of rural Californians maybe are a little more similar perhaps to your average Oklahoman when it comes to some of their political views on government and taxation and such. And Oklahoma has been sort of studying road user charging in an official way. And in talking to some of their leadership, they have said the word equity was a no-go, but fairness mattered a lot to people. So this is optics, and I'm sure there are some people here who will very sensibly argue, no, we shouldn't be talking about fairness. We should talk about equity. But in the interests of bringing as many people into the sort of road user charge support tent, it may be useful to think about, would language like fairness get us where we need to go and perhaps be less polarizing? And then I can't help coming back to my block rate price, because again, to the extent that there are some people who don't want anything different based on income, this gives you most of what you want. The benefit for low income families without having to be explicit about it, and it will add a lot of cost and complication and opportunity for fraud if we are trying to validate everybody's income every year.
Yeah, while a commissioner, I did participate in one of the pilots, and it was interesting to see how it worked. I participated in the one where you would take a photo of your odometer. I think once a month or I forget how often it was, but whatever it was. There was one time I was out of town without my car, and I couldn't take a picture of the odometer, but Caltrans folks were very pestering and persistent about telling me I had to do that. So what I ended up doing was taking a screenshot of the app, which showed the odometer mileage, and sent it in, and they accepted that, and it worked all that well. Some of the questions we're getting are about the mechanical issues of how this would actually work. And Jeannie, there's so much text in the chat here that I can't go through it all. Jeannie, do you want to, there's some mechanical issues you think we could answer real quickly and simply from the participants?
Yeah, there were a number of questions about sort of how do you collect the revenue, which I know the pilot projects that Caltrans has been running has been testing. And especially, I think there was one question about how do you collect revenue from EVs that charge at home instead of at a public charging station, and then related questions about sort of privacy concerns. And I think that would apply to technologies that are tracking vehicles. So it may be easiest to refer folks to look at the results of some of the pilot projects that are looking at those issues. But if anybody on the panel wants to just do maybe a short comment in response to sort of these questions about collection challenges, that might be helpful.
Anyone want to jump in on that? Obviously, there are challenges in collecting data, making sure it's accurate, enforcement, privacy, all those things are key sort of mechanical administrative issues that come up.
Yeah, and I would just say that we need to give folks at least a couple options, right? Not everybody wants to be sharing their GPS data, although the benefits I get from Google by doing so are quite high. So giving folks an option where they're paying an estimated rate, or they're paying potentially even willing to pay a higher rate, but not have to share their data is important, because we have to get, again, it all comes back to trust, and we have to get that right. So without getting into the mechanical issues, I think providing a couple options to kind of meet different typologies of people and levels of trust is important.
May I just
Okay.
add quickly to build on what Zach said? I agree giving people some choice is helpful. I think what we've seen is when we give people the choice to have just like a flat, just black box, here's my miles, versus something like GPS, very few people choose the black box option. And we've seen this going back a long time with tolling as well, where you could get just like one monthly lump sum bill versus each time, and like 2% of people will choose the black box. That's not to say that we shouldn't offer that, because I think it is important to give people choice. The other thing, though, that I will say, and this does concern me, is when states have looked for these, well, let's just give you the alternative to pay a flat annual fee, they tend to set it such that anyone who drives much is saving money. And so now essentially all of those who drive less than whatever that threshold is are subsidizing the high mileage drivers. And so I think if we do this, we need to set that like annual fixed rate quite high, so that we don't, end up subsidizing.
Cheat ourselves out of the revenue we should be collecting.
And it's not fair. Like, I mean, should a low income person who can only afford to drive 5,000 miles a year be subsidizing someone who drives 18,000 miles a year?
All right. So one of the questions we got from the audience was, will the program generate the same or more revenue than the current gas tax? Thoughts?
Yeah, that's something that California is actively exploring now. I think the discussion so far is focused on just doing a revenue neutral so that we're collecting the same amount we've collected before, just so that it's easier to make that transition. And I think it's worth to start with that. But I think, yeah, as this program, develops and we see how well it works, I think there could be conversations on whether we want to increase revenue or not, especially if we want to pay for more, again, like transit, biking and walking projects that are great at, reducing vehicle miles traveled and improving our climate action goals. I think it might be worth to look at possibly increasing revenue. But that's definitely, I think, a step further than when we are right now.
Yeah, and I think to build on Sophia's point, yeah, I think for political purposes, like the only way I think we'd ever pass this is if it's, messaged as revenue neutral, right? But, you know, perhaps over time, there are ways we can continue to grow investments in walking, biking, transit, and electrification. But that doesn't necessarily need to come from charging individuals more. That can come from shifting funds from the most polluting projects, highway expansion projects, to walking, biking, transit, and electrification. So in a lot of ways, it's like we just need to use our resources better and more effectively, of course, while maintaining our, our revenue as we need to. But I think, that's just part of the conversation, that we have to be willing to have.
Yeah, I would also assume that whatever replaces a gas tax would, like the current gas tax, be tagged to inflation, right? I mean, so costs would go up, but they wouldn't go up relative to anything other than inflation, at least from the get-go, probably. Let me go
I
ahead,
just
Asha.
a couple of things. So it may be that revenue neutral is the way to go. Although I'll just point out that 75% of Americans supported raising the federal gas tax by 10 cents per gallon for maintenance and similar for safety. So, and others have made this point too, that I think if we can really let people know what we're spending the money on, that we might be able to, if we want, as a state, to somewhat increase the total amount we collect. The other thing, which is a little different but bugs me, the term revenue neutral gets thrown out. And I think there's often a confusion that this revenue neutral for the individual driver, like versus the amount of money the state will collect. We've all been talking about the amount of money, but I think sometimes people are sort of not necessarily intentionally misled, but the way that phrase is used kind of implies that you as an individual won't see any change. And especially if we go to a flat rate fee, that is not the case. So just
Yeah, that's
encourage everyone.
important. I mean, obviously important to be very clear, transparent, and honest with everybody how this is going to personally affect them, which may depend on what they drive, how far they drive, if they drive, an efficient vehicle, an inefficient vehicle, an electric vehicle, or a fuel cell vehicle versus a highly polluting vehicle, and all those other things that may factor in, whether they're low income or high income, and all of that. There is an EV question here. It says, is the goal of making the fees, and this might be sounds inherently contradictory, so let's point this out. Is the goal of making the fees affordable for EV owners to encourage EV adoptions? Does that run counter to charging more to high income earners, because high income earners are more likely to drive electric vehicles? Get that one? That makes sense to you? Are we pushing things that are kind of running up against each other here when it comes to people who make more money paying more, but people who drive EVs paying less?
So I defer to my colleagues as well, but I think it's like we can turn both dials, and they're both good goals. I would also just say that, while EV adoption rates have tended to favor high income individuals, we shouldn't allow that to be the status quo. We need to make sure that everybody has access to zero emission vehicles, and we need to preserve subsidies to allow them to do so, while also allowing alternatives to driving entirely. And so that's why we need both those dials, because we need to be imagining a future where everybody has transportation access that includes electric vehicles and driving, as well as walking, biking, and public transit. And if we only turn one of those dials, we may have unintended consequences in that future. And we need to get to the future for our climate goals, for affordability, and for a thriving California.
Add one thought to Zach's good points there. So I used to be extremely opposed to the idea because a lot of states talked about, well, let's just have a road user charge on EVs. The gas vehicles are already paying the tax. And at the time, so there are two issues. One is, should we be giving a break financially to people who are driving more climate friendly vehicles? And is that necessary to build up the industry? I think at this point, we've gotten to the point, certainly in California, where we're not going to discourage people from buying EVs because they'll have to pay a little bit more per mile they drive. However, as other people have brought up, there's privacy, there's potential dislike of the road user charge. So and some states have started doing this and have adopted programs where only EV drivers pay a road user charge and everybody else pays a gas tax. I feel like that's kind of penalizing the EV drivers, not so much because of the amount of money that they're necessarily spending, but because they have this slightly more intrusive and cumbersome, tax requirement. So I think it's important to remember that it's not just the cost, but also the whole program and what that requires of people in terms of having an account, making payments, and having some amount of their driving behavior tracked.
Trying to get questions answered, right? Things like
Yeah.
that. Hannah, you have something?
I think it's a really important topic. Like we need a strategy on how electric vehicles fit into this transition. And it's complicated. So EV drivers in California, we do actually pay fees to use the roads. It's just folded into our registration fee annually. But that's not like no one knows that as an EV driver. It's only nerds like us know that, right? And so I think, maybe some like compromise would look like a road user charge. Maybe we pilot it starting with EVs first. Maybe it's lower for electric vehicle drivers in the first 5 years to provide an incentive. Maybe there's even a lower charge for low income EV drivers, but that comes along with removing the EV registration fee. Like we need to be able to show that we're not penalizing, but EV drivers can actually be kind of like leading the charge a little bit around like who's adopting this first. Or maybe there's a small carve out in the revenue for electrification, specifically in low income communities. So I think there's so many different ways we can go about this and be creative. But I think this needs to be done in alignment with, electric vehicle advocates, industry, et cetera, to make sure we're bringing everyone along because we don't need any more enemies on this front of trying to push forward, a really big controversial piece of policy.
Okay, we're going to wrap up in a second, and I'm going to ask you if you have any
Joe,
final
just one
comments. Hold on one second, Asha. But Hannah, you reminded me that I have to confess, the EV that I drive is so old that I do not pay that registration fee. I charge off of solar panels on my house, and I got free charging and all those things. So I am particularly guilty of not paying my fair share. Asha, go ahead.
let me just throw out another idea. So right now we all also pay annual registration fees, as has been mentioned. What if, as a shift to a road user fee, we no longer had to pay those flat once a year payments, which again are harder for low income people to pay? And what if we just rolled all those costs into our mileage fee? So it means people have one. Anyway, I'll just throw it out. I think it could be very appealing to the public.
Okay. Stuart, I'm going to ask you to try to, if you would come on and explain that last question that you have here in our chat, so we can get to that question. Then I'll ask everyone to make some final comments before we wrap things up. Stuart, can you explain that question?
Sure. Jordan had asked, since heavier, larger vehicles cause significantly more wear and tear on our roads, are much more dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists and other vehicles, shouldn't we be looking at charging higher rates for those vehicles? And, sometimes that correlates with fuel efficiency, but obviously sometimes not. Anybody want to take that?
Yes, I mean, certainly. As I understand, California is already looking at that through the SB 339 pilot program study. But yeah, as everything you mentioned, heavy duty vehicles cause a lot of wear and tear. They're very bad for the environment because they're not fuel efficient, and yeah, they're bad for safety. So I think it definitely is an important aspect to include in a road charge fee structure.
Joe, can I take a couple minutes to share something, or are we running short on time?
We are about out of time, but if you have a couple of minutes, make it part of your closing comment.
Okay, but this will be my closing comment. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about road user charge rates, and we often have just thought about it as like there's a rate. Maybe it varies by income. I recommend we sort of mimic the everything bagel concept and think about the everything rec rate, where we break it down into components. So, and this is very clear to the public. So, and these are just numbers for illustrative purposes. They don't mean anything. Like maybe we all pay 1 cent a mile to cover just basic, like having a DMV and a CHP and things. Then we could have a road cost component where depending on how heavy your vehicle is, you pay more or less. We could have I'll call it a carbon component. Again, if you are sort of gas guzzling, you pay more. And then we could even let local governments add on. Maybe if you're in the Bay Area, you pay an extra small amount of money to pay for local needs. And we could certainly add a safety component or anything else into this. And so I'll just throw that out as sort of a concept. The individual components and numbers could change, but another way to think about the rates.
Thank you, Dr. Agrawal. I am fascinated by that idea. I think that could get to a lot of the challenges and the political headwinds. Closing comments from anyone else? No?
I can
No?
go next.
Go ahead, Sophia, then Zach.
Yeah, well, I think this is a very exciting and interesting conversation, and I think it's important to have because a lot of these programs take a long time to implement. So we really need to be thinking through all of the little details of a road charge program right now, and I appreciate everyone who added questions and comments on things, how this program can be improved. Encourage you definitely to talk to your legislators and elected officials about that. And just want to say, I think this program has a very strong potential to help us with achieving our climate inequality goals because we can really use this opportunity to, as almost like a blank slate, to rethink how we're investing our transportation dollars. And I think that's the most important kind of impact of this program is just aligning those investments with the strategies and goals California has in terms of improving its climate and equity.
Yeah, and I would just add, there's urgency to make this change due to the declining gas tax, but there's also just urgency to improve the lives of Californians, and this is a way to do that. We have to understand that inaction is the worst possible outcome for Californians. So we got to get this right. We got to make sure there's fairness. We got to make sure there's accountability. We got to make sure that we meet our transportation goals and support our transportation infrastructure. But inaction is the worst possible outcome, and we, as Californians, as a society, need to move forward, saying yes, and let's get it right. Let's work to move this forward.
Thank you. Hannah, anything else?
If we don't use road user charge as an opportunity to spend our funds differently, I think this will be the biggest missed opportunity to fix our broken transportation system that literally is not working for anyone. If you're poor, you have, insanely long commutes, you're at risk of getting hit by a car. Even if you're wealthy, you're stuck in traffic. Like no one is winning in this status quo. And so in order to convince the public that road user charge is something that needs to be supported, we have to make the case that the revenue will in fact reduce traffic. It will reduce transportation costs, make our lives safer, make our lives better.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you to the panelists. let me do the conclusion, the wrap up, talk about perhaps some action items, and thank everyone. So, quick review. Newer cars and trucks they use less gasoline and diesel fuel than older ones, the less efficient ones, and many people have switched to zero emission vehicles, so they're using no gasoline at all. And it's as a result of this, the money that we're raising from gas taxes is declining, and that's a problem because we use gas taxes to build and maintain transportation infrastructure in California, everything from highways to bike lanes and sidewalks. And we've discussed how the gas tax is regressive, which means that people who can't afford to pay it are paying just as much as millionaires and billionaires. So that issue could be addressed, and that we realize that we're going to have no choice but to replace the gas tax if we want to maintain our roads and our transportation system. But we also have an opportunity to make sure that whatever replaces it is more fair to low-income Californians who are paying this disproportionate amount of their income on gas taxes at the moment. And we also have an opportunity to direct funds from whatever replaces the gas tax and the diesel tax, which we didn't do it. We did a disservice to the diesel tax today, but that also is part of this issue. And we have this opportunity to align those revenues with our climate and equity goals. And that means that in addition to safety and maintenance projects, which people strongly support, we could have funding for public transit and projects to create safe places to walk and to bike and other good stuff like that. And we also talked about how this will not be easy. And there's a lot of work for us to do. And before we can eliminate the gas tax and replace it with something better. And I think also we've learned that there are alternatives on how we approach this, and they could be structured differently. And we've got a lot of work to do. And in terms of action items, I think that we would recommend people pay attention to the California Transportation Commission's Road User Charge Technical Advisory Group, that Caltrans and CalSTA have done pilot studies to familiarize yourself with those pilot studies. And there's one ongoing right now that's planned for next year to familiarize yourself with that, to track what other states are doing and the progress that they're making and the options that they're exploring. There are going to be, and we didn't really talk about this, legislative hearings from, for sure, the Assembly Transportation Committee chair is going to be having some hearings on taking the road charge to the road show, just to explore this issue and to develop better understanding and engagement on it. And that we should perhaps talk about fairness instead of equity to get more support. And we should consider alternatives such as the block rate and the everything bagel approach, which it would be somewhat entertaining if the solution to this is that boils down to an everything bagel. So let me wrap up. I want to thank our panelists, CTC Chair Darnell Grisby for his keynote comments and framing comments, to Zach, to Sophia, to Dr. Agrawal, and to Hannah for serving on our panel today. Thank you to CCA staff members, Jordan Brazil and Nicole Roberts, who behind the scenes have made this all possible and kept it running smoothly. And thank all of you, the participants who have attended both directly in the Zoom and on the YouTube live stream. Sorry about the having to send you there, but that's the way it works when you don't have a huge Zoom account. Please, all of you, pay attention to this issue. Don't give up. Keep learning about it. Keep supporting clean transportation and clean air and climate protection. May every breath you take be a breath of clean air. Have a great day, a safe day. Bye for now. Thank you.